In 2025, state education officials took steps to ensure that public school students are receiving instruction about personal finances before they graduate. The teachings can be folded into existing subject areas as a standalone class or part of a career and technical education programming, with an expectation that graduates will be capable of managing their personal finances and making sound economic decisions. Personal finances would need to be part of the 5 through 12 curriculum starting in the 2026-2027 school year and be available to kids K through 4 the following year. To discuss the proposed instruction, including what it should look like, we're joined on the Capitol Press Room by Yanely Espinal, Director of Educational Outreach for Next Gen Personal Finance, a nonprofit that provides personal finance curriculum to school districts. Welcome to the show, Yanely.
Thank you, David. And we should mention that we provide that curriculum free of cost, as well as teacher training totally free of cost.
Well, yeah, I want to get into the logistics of all of that. But for starters, what are the core elements that you think a student needs to learn by the time they graduate high school to ensure they are capable of managing their personal finances and making sound economic decisions, which are the goals of the State Board of Regents here?
Yeah, I mean, the basics are going to be when you get your very first paycheck, if you earn income, what does that look like? It means hopefully that you have some direct deposit set up, which means you got to understand banking. You got to know the difference between a debit card and a credit card, which lots of teenagers think they look exactly the same, so they must be exactly the same. So we have to teach them about banking. We have to teach them about budgeting. We have to teach them about consumer skills like comparison shopping when you're in the supermarket or when you're shopping for clothes or back to school supplies. Not all items or products are created equal, and comparison shopping is super important. And then that also lends itself to, being a consumer in the financial market. So thinking about insurance products, investment accounts and investment products, and, loans, right? They have to understand student loans, car loans, personal loans, and credit card loans, because the reality is they think credit cards is free money, but credit cards are loans as well. So really helping students understand the context within which they will function as a, as a taxpayer in this country. You have to understand that there's a financial context, right? Your credit score is super important also to understand what factors help you boost your score versus what are the actions that you should avoid doing because it actually hurts your score, and really helping them understand how to manage debt if they do choose to take on debt, how to do it responsibly and how to manage it as well so that they have a healthy financial reputation. So there's lots of different components, but I would say those are kind of the main buckets.
Well, it's one thing to empower kids with the critical learning skills that enables them to navigate financial decisions as they pop up. It's another thing to teach them specifically what to be on the lookout for. So do you think it's more important to do the former, or is it the latter that students should walk away from with this new education requirement?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the key is really meeting them where they are. If we start talking to students about 401k accounts and retirement
Sure.
planning, we're going to lose them instantly because they're just not living through those experiences and decisions yet. So we have to find them where they are, which is, thinking about should they get a job or not, thinking about trying to decide whether they want to go to college, and if so, how they're going to pay for it, and thinking about whether they want to get their first car, how to save up for it. Should they lease it? Should they try and buy it? Should they get a car loan? All of these decisions are actually happening right now in the lives of 16, 17, and 18-year-olds. So it's interesting that a lot of adults that I've met who say like, oh yeah, there's so many decisions that they will have to make when they're adults. I go, no, they are already making these decisions right now every day about life after high school, about current financial choices. Prom and graduation tickets are expensive. They have to think about saving up for that. There's all of these different decisions that are top of mind for teenagers today. So we start there and we hook them with those things because we know it's relevant and it's immediately applicable. But then they start to see the value and they see the relevance. And then they start wondering about, well, how do I buy a house? And what about, improving my credit score so I can get a lower interest rate on a house? And then eventually when I make bigger moves, like maybe I want to start a business, how do I get a business loan? So then they really actually get caught up in it and they get really excited and engaged, and it becomes a lot easier to start talking to them about things like retirement or long-term investing once you've hooked them with the things that are immediately relevant.
Well, your organization is advocating that this type of financial literacy is best obtained through a dedicated standalone class, while the State Board of Regents argues for some flexibility for school districts in terms of how they want to impart that knowledge onto students. In fact, they want to give that option of letting those types of lessons be folded into other classes. And I could see how there are practical examples that might work in a math class or a home and careers class and other classes maybe not directly linked to financial literacy. Why do you think the restrictive way of saying you have to do a class is the best way to ensure that kids are getting the information they need while also ensuring that school districts are capable of doing this?
I mean, I think that the key is I'm a former classroom teacher. So I remember being in the classroom, and what you're given is you are given a set of standards and units of study that you have to cover during the time that you have the students, right? And so let's say that's a semester, which is typically going to be about 18 weeks of instructional time. You are given this scope of content that you have to cover in that 18 weeks. So let's say that that is for economics or for business or entrepreneurship. Now you have to figure out where in these 18 weeks am I going to squeeze in personal financial literacy content and lessons and figure out where they can go. I obviously still have to teach all the content that I need to teach for this existing course, but I need to find ways to sprinkle in or overlap financial lessons. And it's just impossible to sprinkle in and squeeze in all of those content areas that we talked about, from banking and budgeting and careers and taxes and insurance and investments and credit, all of those things and more being squeezed in. You start to realize it's really not feasible. And so when you actually look at what the research shows, it shows that when you try to squeeze in instruction like that or sprinkle some lessons, which essentially the term for that is embedded instruction, you're embedding it within another existing class, that it leads to no improvements that are measurable in terms of financial well-being in the long run for students who've taken courses where financial literacy is sprinkled in. And what you actually see when they get a full dedicated semester course that is dedicated to these specific topics in a scope that makes sense in the sequence, where they're learning one topic and it overlaps into the next and leads to the next. And so they get all of the financial literacy topics in that 18 weeks of dedicated instructional time. That has 6 times more improvements in graduates' financial well-being in the long run versus embedded instruction. And specifically, it really improves when it comes to credit scores. Students have higher credit scores, higher savings rates, and lower interest that they're paying on loans if they do decide to borrow. So for example, student loans, they would know that they need to look at federal student loan options and exhaust those first before even considering the higher interest rate private student loans. That's not taught in any other course except for a personal financial literacy class.
So right now, as Next Gen Personal Finance has documented, there are only a handful of districts around the state that are requiring some sort of standalone personal financial literacy class. So how do we go from the current landscape to what you'd like to see, which is everybody offering a standalone class, and what would potentially be Next Gen Personal Finance's role in that?
So I would say, yeah, even though there's just a small percentage of schools or districts that require a standalone course for every student, there's actually a pretty large percentage that have a standalone course. It's just as an elective right now. So we're not going from 0% to 100% here. We're actually going towards a place where we're actually saying, hey, how do we bridge this gap? How do we make sure that there's a ton of percentage of students that are taking this course as an elective that they're opting into? And let's look at that gap and look at all the students who don't get a chance to opt into that class, either because it was already at capacity and they signed up for the wait list and didn't make it, or because they chose fashion design or robotics instead of personal finance. I don't blame them. I wouldn't think that personal finance would sound very sexy when I was 16 either, but I've learned to see the value and I truly wish I had the class. So now what we're doing is actually just trying to bridge that gap and to say, let's look at all of the students who don't actually get to take the class and how do we now increase the number of sections of personal financial literacy, and also obviously not make it elective or optional anymore, but ensure that every single student gets to take the course. And so it's essentially going to come down to, do we have a trained core of teachers who is confident, competent to teach this material? And, we've spent years, over a decade already, training teachers at no cost with our free professional development teacher training. And we have over 9,000 teachers in the state of New York alone that are already signed up to use our curriculum and access our free teacher training. They've done over 35,000 hours of professional development with us. So they've got the content, they've got the knowledge, they're confident, they're ready. It's just that a lot of their schools don't require the course. It's just an elective. So many of them are not actually getting to teach it to all their students, only to the ones who actually opt in and luckily get to take this elective before they graduate.
Well, sticking with the idea of capacity, if this was a required standalone class, is there reason to believe that kids 5 through 12th grade would have access to it by the 2026-2027 school year, which is what the State Board of Regents envisions for the more lax requirement?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think it brings up this issue of expecting schools to be able to turn around 1 year to the next and just be able to magically get this done. Listen, as a teacher, former teacher, I know that these things take time. And so what I would say is that the ideal way to do it is to actually have a timeline of several years during which there's this transition towards implementing a required course for all high school graduates. And so something like in grades 5 through 8, they would have embedded instruction, they would get early exposure. And then by the time they get to high school, the incoming class of, let's say, a class of maybe 2028 or incoming class of 2029 or 2030, that graduating class would be incoming in a few years, but it would be 4 years before they actually go to graduate in 2030. So that way, schools don't have to immediately turn around and have every single student taking the course, but saying, hey, by the time these freshmen coming in 2026, by the time that they go to graduate in 2030, we have to make sure that they all get a chance to take this course. So it really gives a few years of runway for teachers to prepare, for districts to decide, how are they going to actually roll it out. And in many other states, because there's 30 states right now that already do this. New York, we're kind of falling behind here a little bit. And so what we can do is we can look to the 30 states that have already done this and see what have they done creatively to get this done. And many of them have created flexibility in how it gets implemented. So they've said, let's give districts local control to decide whether students can use this personal financial literacy course as a social studies credit, as a math credit, as an elective credit. Like, where can they fit it into the credits that they already have to meet to graduate, and get them to essentially help them, assist them to meet their graduation requirements faster by using the personal financial literacy course creatively to plug it in where they need it most. And some districts even decide, let's make it a math offering. So through financial algebra, for example, that's essentially a personal financial literacy course, but looking at it from a mathematical perspective and really allowing students to get extra math credits that way. So I think the creative approach is really giving districts control to decide where does it fit within existing credit requirements so that we don't have to increase the number of requirement credits, and essentially creating a net zero change so that students aren't being bogged down by additional credits, but instead have flexibility to plug it in where they need it most.
Well, there are only so many credit hours available to students. So, what about for that student, whether it's because of the teachings they get at home or their own experience in the workforce, or maybe they're just generally curious and can't get enough of Jim Cramer, and they know this stuff, they find it rudimentary. Should they have an ability to test out of this, for example, and to avoid, say, a standalone class if it was something that was required because they wanted to pursue other classes with their limited time?
I think it's a great question. I remember thinking about like my own high school graduation requirements. And, I went to school in New York City. And when it was time to graduate, I was looking at like, okay, what are all the options, right? To meet I could take AP courses, I could take dual credit, I could do honors classes, I could find other ways to make sure that the content is as rigorous as I need it to be without necessarily opting out completely, because there's so much value in having a class where you actually get a chance to think critically about your values when it comes to money and, all of the different pieces of it. There's behavioral, psychological pieces that you likely wouldn't get unless you have a dedicated formal course where you have space and time to think about these things like social media and advertising, sports betting, which is now being legalized on phones, mobile phones. And we saw all the ads at the Super Bowl, which cryptocurrency, pushing crypto and AI and pushing sports betting. And so I do think that these kinds of topics, we need to reckon with them. We need to give teenagers an opportunity to think about the modern economy and and the constant nudging that they're going to face to spend their money through constant ads and the barrage of financial technology products. I don't know that opting out by saying, oh, I already know all this stuff. It's like you might know like vocabulary and certain concepts, but have you really had the space and time to think critically about how you're going to be making decisions and thinking about every financial decision you're going to make every day for the rest of your life? And so I would rather than saying students should be able to opt out or test out, I would say they should be able to find more rigorous options like an AP or an honors course or a dual enrollment course, so that it's at the level of rigor that they need and require, rather than saying, oh, they're good, we don't actually need to enroll them in this class at all, because I think that that does more harm than good. And every student really, we want to set them up to be on an equal playing field in terms of getting exposure to all of these topics, from interest rates to investments to banking to all of the topics, as well as the modern financial topics like TikTok investment advice, and how to make sure that you're not falling for social media scams and things like that, which I think are less likely to be discussed in the home.
Well, we've been speaking with Yanely Espinal. She's the Director of Educational Outreach for Next Gen Personal Finance. Yanely, thank you so much for making the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, David. This was fun.
And for more Capital Press Room content, visit capitalpressroom.org or wherever you download your favorite podcasts.